I'm Helen, therapist, author, and your host of the I Don't Think We Talk Enough About podcast, where every week I'm joined by wonderful guests who bring their warmth, wisdom, and wealth of experience to talk about the things I just don't feel we talk enough about. And today I'm joined by Alice Law, a stress management consultant, to talk about, you've guessed it, stress. Alice is also the co-author of the best-selling book with Mo Gaudet, Unstressable. Stress sadly affects us all, no one's immune. So I'm delighted to welcome Alice today, who will be bringing her beautiful expertise to help us hopefully live a life a little more stress-free. Alice, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I feel calm already because your voice is so soothing.
Thank you. That's so kind of you to say. And we followed each other for a while on Instagram, haven't we?
Yeah.
And this is the wonderful thing about this face-to-face podcast is I get to meet people in real life.
Yeah, it's so nice. Like you say, also when you're on a screen and then you see someone and then you meet them in real life, you're like, oh, it's a real person. How nice.
I
so
know.
lovely.
And there's something different, isn't there? There's something different in the energy
Yeah, totally.
than when you meet someone on screen to when you meet them face-to-face. And Alice is lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So lovely to have you here. And obviously we're talking about stress today. Your fantastic book you wrote with Mo, it took you a couple of years to write, didn't it? I remember Mo saying.
The irony was it took us a short time to write, but a couple of years to get it out. So it was kind of like we'd sort of finished it in 8 months together, and then there was a lot of delays with publishing. So we were so happy when it was finally out in the world.
Oh, of course you were. And it's called Unstressable. I'm going to hold it up for the camera for those people who do watch. Unstressable. A practical guide to stress-free living. That's a promise. Do you want to share a little bit about this? There's a big thing underneath it, isn't there? A theme about #1 million unstressable. Wow, tell me.
Yeah, so it's mine and Mo's mission to help take 1 million people a year out of stress. And so that for us is in different avenues, whether it's like coming on podcasts with wonderful people like you and writing the book and doing talks, and then also our Unstressable membership and having a community. But for us, it was something that we both felt really passionate about because of our own personal experiences, and we really realised how much of an issue stress is today and how many people are really suffering alone with it, or just not really understanding how we work in this modern world or how our system works or how any of it works. So we wanted to try and bring everything we'd both learnt in like 10 different years of doing different things and experiences to put it into one place for people. And it's a lot of content, to devour, but that's why, because it's really... We believed it's kind of, stress has been quite a blanket topic for quite a while. It's kind of like, oh, I'm stressed. Whereas we really like to break it into these 4 parts and really look at it in a different way. So
No, you've done that. And I really enjoyed reading the book. And actually what you said there, and I think it's really pertinent to say and bring back actually, was that thing around, or that concept around people feeling alone with it. And actually, we come to a question later on in the podcast from my Instagram community, and there's a real sadness to that loneliness with stress, isn't it? As if we can't actually admit that we're stressed, as if that's a failing or a weakness. But actually, there's a pandemic of stress hitting. And actually, do you mind if I just read some of your stats?
Of course.
You can read them if you want to, but I've got them
please.
here. Are you sure? But I think this just puts it into perspective when you bring in the research. It's not just you and me sat there saying, yes, we see lots of stressed people. There's lots of research going on around it. And here, you've written in your book, in the UK, studies showed that 74% of Brits are so stressed that they feel unable to cope with their life. 51% of those reported feeling depressed, and 61% reported feeling anxious. Stress has overtaken musculoskeletal problems, so we're looking at back pain here as well, from sitting at our desks too long. That's the other thing, isn't it? We're inside sitting at our desks too long and not outside where we should be more.
Totally.
It's one of the top reasons for work-related absence. This figure, with 17.9 million working days lost in the UK alone to stress every year. And then even more concerning is that more than 120,000 people in the US die every year due to work-related stress. And that's despite spending more than 190 billion treating illnesses associated with stress.
Yeah.
And I want to keep reading, but I'll end up just reading your entire book out on the podcast. But then you talk about the gone are the days with the carefree youth. The younger you are, the more stressed you are likely to be. 61% of Gen Z adults aged 18 to 23 report they felt stressed during the immediate prior month. This is significantly higher than all other generations. I mean, I think I'm just going to hand the podcast over to you and tell me, what can we do? What can we do about it? Actually, no, it's too big a question. I'll take that back. Let's define stress.
Yeah.
Let's slow it down, Helen. Let's define
I would
stress.
also just add, Helen, because we have a stress quiz on Stressful, and we've realised literally 2 days ago that over 15,000 people have taken that quiz now, to show them what percentage of stress they have and where, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, they're the most stressed. And the highest was mental stress. Second highest was emotional stress. And very close behind was physical, and very close behind that was spiritual. But I think it was over 70% of all people were in the very high sort of amber to red range on the stress radar of green, amber and red. And I was like, that's over 15,000 people have taken this. And that's our own research we're sort of collating at the moment. And it's just staggering. And it adds only to you research these things for a book and you get those stats. And then when you actually have it coming into your, sort of basket, essentially, with data you're creating yourself, it just really blew my mind. And we're getting such interesting, points of how many people aren't sleeping, how many people are struggling with worry, how many people are feeling lonely. So yeah, I think the stats, like you say, they really do just speak for themselves, sadly, at the moment.
They do. And I think when we come back to loneliness, I hope that people can feel, I want to say this lightly and obviously from a very kind place, that I hope people feel a little bit less alone with their own battles, that there are other people also struggling and that we need to be doing more to help. Obviously, you're a stress management coach. How are you working with that with people?
Yeah, so for me, I used to do a lot of one-to-one with stuff with people, which I love, but now I'm enjoying doing one-to-many because of this reason, because there's just so many people in need and a lot of people who also can't get that one-to-one help for various reasons, whether it's financial, whether it's time, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I've been really looking at kind of creating workshops for people around this theme, but also the community piece of actually having a space online for people to not feel isolated. So it's like sharing webinars, sharing meditation, sharing tools in a more tangible way, and having a community of like-minded people who are going through similar things. And so then they actually share with each other in the community space, and it becomes its own, narrative and nice space for people to feel, oh, okay, I'm not the only person who's having a problem with my anxiety this week, or I'm not the only person who has felt so overwhelmed that they couldn't, get out of bed this morning. It's just nice to have that space to either encourage one another to keep going when they feel good, or to just be like, hands up, I'm actually not doing very well with this week, and know that they're not the only one in the world that's feeling that way.
And Alice, also to encourage people when they're feeling low.
Yeah.
That support. And you raise a very important point there. And we talk a lot about it in the therapeutic space, about we heal in community. And we're losing community, aren't we? And as I was reading your book, I was jotting down lots of notes. And the one thing that I felt was so important, and I seem to say it a lot in a lot of my podcasts, we're missing so often the key ingredient of healing. Most things around mental health and mental wellness, which is support.
Yeah.
And that's desperately sad, because with the right support, the right connections, people are less likely to struggle with stress, because they won't feel so isolated. And we go right back, as a therapist who's psychoanalytically trained, we go back to John Bowlby in the 50s looking at attachment theory. And actually those with secure attachment are more likely to have the resources and the resilience to cope with stress as they get older, or find healthier ways to cope with stress, not turning to unhealthy self-soothing techniques like drugs and alcohol, or food consumption, or gambling, or anything to get that dopamine fix of feeling better in the moment, to numb the feeling of stress. It's not just the stressful environment that's causing the stress. It's actually everything that's happened before as well, isn't it? So that healing in community, not feeling so alone, and what you're doing with that community is exactly that.
No, I think it's so important, like you say, it's that. I think as well, when we know with stress that we can also isolate ourselves when we're emotionally stressed, for example, and withdraw from loved ones, even if you have them around. Or people can just feel more lonely as a result of stress, like you say. And I think having that space, whether it's a friend, whether it's a community, whether it's a therapist, to actually that be the point that you go into, because you're brave enough to actually go into your feelings with someone and just share, rather than the opposite of suppression and, you know, going out as much as possible, working, distracting, drinking alcohol to numb yourself, all the different things we love to do just to not feel.
I know.
And I think it's just that ability to be like, okay, I will be okay if I actually go into my feelings. But the reality is that so many of us don't even know how to manage our emotions, because we've been taught how to think and not how to feel.
I know, and we often say that people are either cognitive or feeling. And if you've not been shown how to feel, or someone only held space for your positive emotions, not labeling them good or bad, but if you grew up with someone only holding space for happiness, success, as opposed to holding space for anger or frustration, you won't know how to handle those when they, of course, arrive when you're older. You know, but anyway, we jumped back. We went back, and I really wanted you to define, you know, what is stress.
Yeah, so I mean, stress from, you know, that biological standpoint is a survival mechanism, and so from what in wonderful times, fight or flight stress response, it's part of our autonomic nervous system. You know, it's made up of parasympathetic, your rest and digest, or your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight, and that was essentially as like a sort of, you know, the amygdala, that part of your brain, and part of the limbic system, which controls your emotions, and the fight and flight, behavioral, all those things. It's like a little alarm system constantly scanning for threats consciously for us to keep us safe. So when a tiger used to come out of the bushes, your fight or flight would go off immediately. Cortisol, all those wonderful stress hormones, flood through your body and prepare you to hopefully run away from the tiger, or, you know, fight it if you felt you could. And then as soon as the threat was over, it would go off. So stress in its sort of biological mechanism is a survival mechanism. You know, nowadays to get you out of the way of a car would be what you would think of, oh, well, that's the comparison. But it's not, sadly, because today your stress response, the tigers are in our minds. You know, our stress response is going off all the time, from whether it's our stressful thoughts, worrying about a deadline, worrying about a relationship, whatever the many things we have to think about, or the many, many micro stresses we have in our world, even when something that stressful and big isn't going on in our lives, you know, whether it's your digital devices, again, getting stuck in traffic, all these things. And so while stress is that, you know, essentially meant to be a survival mechanism, it's now kind of working against us because our brain hasn't caught up to this modern world that we've created. And so it sees everything as a threat. And I kind of define stress as a sort of disconnection from safety. So whatever our system thinks isn't safe, that's when your stress response is going to go off.
I love that explanation, and it's got me thinking about, it's actually, if someone can or people can reframe it to thinking, actually I can be soothed by this because it's just my body telling me that I need to listen. And then slow yourself down and not give in to the stress response and actually listen. And actually we'll come to that in a minute, because I know you've got some great theories around how to combat stress. And funnily enough, my daughter and I were having a chat this morning around wanting a simpler life. And actually that's sometimes an indication that you've taken on too much. And it's just interesting. Listen, what's that actually saying? What's the message behind that? You know, pay attention. And actually, that leads us on quite nicely, because you and Mo talk about stress being not just preventable. No, stress as preventable, not just manageable. And that it's not the events of our lives that stress us, it's the way we deal with them. And I let that sit in for a bit and notice how my nervous system responds. And sometimes I think, I feel a bit attacked. It's how I'm responding. It's my fault. And then it's like, no, detach from that. But you can feel a bit...
Yeah, totally. We've had, a little bit of pushback with that with people for sure.
No, I can feel it. But it's completely accurate. Because if we have the ability to cope with that stress or handle that stress, we actually move to a different state on the nervous system. We can actually activate the parasympathetic. So as much as my initial reaction, I always pay attention to that, listen, give it meaning, and then move away from it. But I thought that was quite interesting. So I'm sure that brings up that response in many people. But it's the truth. It's how we actually respond to it. So you devised I've called it a simple model, because I think you define it as a simple model around the 3 L's.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a bit?
So the 3 L's are limit, learn, and listen. So for us, we wanted to look at, it's looking at where your stress is coming from, which is another model we have that I can go through.
Okay.
Once you find out where your stress is coming from, then you can limit the needless stress in your life. So those micro stresses that we're talking about, things that we really do just let in without sort of realizing how much one does nothing, but 70 that day actually gets your system into a certain state. So, like thinking like your aggressive factory morning alarm jolting you out of bed, and I even had that the other day, actually. I swapped phones over, forgot I have a very soothing alarm, and it's like a meditation song, and I'm like, morning. And then I'd swap phones over, I forgot, for some reason it just didn't do my alarm, over. And I woke up for the first time probably in like 5 years to that really aggressive factory setting. And I just felt my whole body like flood with cortisol. And I was like, this is why I don't do this. And I was like, wow, okay. But, that's the thing. We really are kind of, flooding our system with tiny bits of stress, not thinking much of it. But then it just sort of, adds up and adds up. So it's limiting that needless stress where you can.
And I'm thinking here of our stress cup. It's limiting the things that are in there, isn't it?
Totally.
So give some other examples. I know people love real examples.
Of course. So we talk about micro external stresses, we call them nuisances in our book. And nuisances are littered throughout our day. And the average person will wake up in the morning and have had 15 to 20 nuisances before they've even left the house.
Oh my gosh.
So you think about that, you're like,
you'd have to relook your at your morning routine, wouldn't you?
You would, but that's that a lot of people just are sort of subconsciously sort of gliding through without realizing these are happening in their system. So it's the morning alarm, and then you go straight to your phone to check your phone whilst you're still in bed, and you get flooded with notifications from WhatsApp, people asking you things you haven't yet replied to, an upsetting email that you think that's either upset me or no, I haven't done that. You're looking at your calendar thinking, do I have time to do this? These are all little nuisances in your system. Okay. Then you check the morning headlines, and you're flooded again with more nuisances. And what the majority of us obviously haven't remembered is that our stress response will still go off from us watching the news. Even if we're not there, your stress response is still watching something horrific. Today, the news isn't fun to watch, as we know. It's full of horrors. So limiting even the amount you watch the news can have a huge impact. So, you watch the news, and then you go onto social media because you think, why not just have a quick scroll? And then you find that you stumble upon either, a friend's account who's on a holiday that you wish you were on, and it's raining and a gale outside in the UK. So you have a bit of a comparison situation, or you fall onto an influencer's or whatever it is, and you have that moment on social media that adds stress to you. And then you sort of get up and you'll look in the mirror, and you will start to do the micro internal. So we call that noise. It's just, looking at yourself in the mirror going,
stay in bed.
I feel old this morning, or my hair's frizzy, whatever it is, just a quick niggle, And so that's one comment. No one's going to die from saying their hair looks frizzy once. But if you're telling yourself negative little comments all day, that really adds up.
You're right. We jest, but actually that the reality of that negative self-talk on body image is really damaging.
Exactly. So then you've sort of done that. You've got up and then you think, okay, I'm going to make my morning coffee. Maybe you've run out of a coffee pod because you didn't manage to do it the day before. Your child has lost their sock, like can't find it for the way to school. And then you get out of the house and you get stuck in traffic and you're late for a meeting. And so all those tiny little micro stresses, that's really actually a lot of stress in your system before you've even got to the stressful meeting that you were worried about in the first place.
I know. And you can feel it all drip, 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 can't you?
Is that drip, drip? That is the best analogy. It's like one of those little coffee things.
I know. I talk a lot about the water glass, and that, when it's very full, a psychotherapist shared this with me years ago. And, when that water level is low, you can take the drips. But when that water level is really high, one more drip, like the coffee, I'm using coffee as an example, the coffee pod, that could tip you over the edge. And that's before you've even put your shoes on to walk out the door,
Exactly.
And the phones are a huge part in that, though. If you actually look at what you said there, a lot of it was modern living.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And that's why when we talked about that stress response before, our stress response going off from this crazy world we've created for ourselves. Studies now show that the average person will swipe and tap their phone over 2,500 times a day, which is crazy when you think about it. And that's just, if you think about it, it's usually because your phone is in front of you. So you think, oh, I'll just pick it up and look. And there's not even anything coming through at that point as a notification, but we've become so addicted to that dopamine hit, or whether it's just the constant reaction of just knowing it's like a habit, it's there, I'll just check it. And so that constantly having this information overload just from our phone alone, that we've all been in those situations where 1 minute you're on Instagram and suddenly you end up in like your aunt's cat's dog's Instagram account, and you're like, how am I here? I don't even know.
I know we have to be very intentional about our phone usage. Anyway, sorry.
So that's looking at limiting those things, because it really is, we can reduce a lot of needless stress, as Mona, I would say, in our lives, from limiting things like changing your morning alarm to something soothing, making sure you limit the amount of time that your app sets you to have on Instagram every day. So even if you go, you'll get that notification saying you've used up 45 minutes today. So that at least it's then intentional, like you say, do I continue or do I put my phone down? I should probably put my phone down now because I've already spent 45 minutes of it on Instagram. And, limiting the amount you watch the news every week, because the reality is that if something big happens, someone will tell you. So you don't need to keep checking it every 5 hours, watching the same story get a little bit worse. And, just trying to sort of really minimize that stress that's, just flooding your system, drip feeding in the morning. And so once we can limit the needless stress, then we learn the skills. So with the 3 L's, it's limit, learn, listen. Learn the skills that you need to manage the stress effectively that you can't either limit or that's just going to be a part of your life, from, having a stressful job or going through something like a life situation that you need to handle. And then learning the 4 languages of the self. So mind, heart, body, soul. So mental stress, emotional stress, physical stress, and spiritual stress, and how each of those 4 parts of us, we believe and found that, get stressed in a different way. And when we can understand which part of us is speaking to us and which part is stress, then we can really calm it down much more easily and more effectively.
You said about learning ways to cope with the things that are stressful in your life. How can we start to share with some of my listeners here to this podcast today? How can they learn?
Yeah, so it's a broad question, because it's obviously we break it into those 4 parts. So it's really about learning the skills to individually manage your mind, learn the skills to process your emotions, learn the skills to soothe your body and bring it out of your stress response and back into rest and digest and nourish it. And then learn the skills to actually tap into your intuition and to listen to your soul and listen to that part of you. So I can go into different parts of
those. Please. And you talk about them as learning the new languages, 4 new languages. And as I read it, I got a lot from that breaking down, because I think sometimes when we look at stress, it feels all too much.
Yeah.
But when you look at the components of it, it makes it perhaps more manageable, so it doesn't feel quite so big.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really interesting when you look at the 4 components, because a really good example is, for example, when you think, I can define the 4 types of stress, first of all, if you like, and those mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, because it's interesting when you see how they are so different. That, for example, a really good example would be a very successful person who thinks they've got their life totally together and finds their job isn't stressful. They kind of like enjoy the kind of, you know, they're running on energy of it, and they've got a good relationship, but they still feel like something's missing in their life. They feel out of place. They can't quite put their finger on that lack of sort of sense of authenticity, sense of purpose, sense of self. I define that as spiritual stress.
Okay.
And so, you know, we'll go through them, but it's like knowing then, okay, because on paper, everything's going really well, and actually I'm not stressed in my mind. So why do I feel like uneasy? When we actually really can break these down into those 4 parts, it becomes a lot easier to understand how you are feeling in terms of stress, like you say, because it's become such a blanket term to just be like, I'm stressed. I mean, that's a huge, you know, that could mean anything. It really could for people.
I know.
So
you're right, it is a blanket term. And before we came on camera, I said to you, I had a really stressful situation this morning. I'm not going to share here, but that was a stressful situation as opposed to I'm stressed. But we use the same language.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want to define?
Yeah, of course. So mental stress is obviously all about your mind. It's looking at you when we're mentally stressed. We spend a lot of time in rumination, worrying, you know, thinking about the past, going over things we should have done. Why didn't I do that? Or worrying about the future. We find it hard to focus and we have trouble racing thoughts, and sleepless nights. We're either trouble sleeping because we can't get to sleep because we're just overthinking, or we wake up in the middle of the night thinking about what we were worried about before we went to bed. And so that's, you know, it's really all about that mental, just constant distraction. You're very unlikely to be able to be present because you're always in a conversation with someone. You'll be thinking about what you're stressed about rather than actually being in the moment. Emotional stress I find really interesting because it's 2 sides in terms of you'll either feel certain feelings, which we could talk about, or you'll behave a certain way.
Let's talk about this.
So a lot of the time people obviously think, well, I'm not emotionally stressed because they've managed to suppress their emotions and numb them so much. But, you know, they won't be feeling things, well, they won't be connected to the feeling of feeling stressed, feeling worried, feeling anxious, feeling easily irritated, you know, snapping at loved ones like you were talking about earlier, that last little thing. It's not about what they did. It's just that last straw that breaks the camel's back. You know, feeling irritated, feeling even low, isolated. We talked about that earlier, sadness. We also know that long-term chronic stress has the ability to turn into depression. And so, you know, those are some of the emotions that can be tied around stress. But then we also look at the behavioral. So if people are like, well, I don't feel that way because they've really shut down their emotions, a lot of the people recognize behavioral changes from emotional stress. So you look at things like, okay, are you constantly numbing yourself by overworking, going out a lot, overeating to comfort eat to numb your emotions, or forgetting to eat and losing your appetite, having trouble sleeping, really having your memory really dwindling and can't remember like why you were doing a certain thing, or walking into a room, short-term memory that is, because as we know with stress, with cortisol, it actually can shrink a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is all about that short-term memory. And so looking at, you know, those kind of things, even like changing your libido, and it's just those behavioral changes that a lot of people will be like, oh yeah, well, I binge watch Netflix when I feel stressed, or yeah, I go straight for a pizza, or even just, you know, going straight for a glass of alcohol. And I love a glass of wine as much as the next person, don't get me wrong, but going straight for a glass of alcohol as that ability to soothe you rather than actually looking at why you're going for it in the first place, just because you don't want to go into the feeling of why you're stressed or what you're feeling. And
looking there, I'm drawn to say that looking at the function of the action.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't have the or don't allow ourselves to have the self-awareness of why we're doing it. But and we'll come to that a little bit later actually, but we so often lack the self-awareness, or choose not to have the self-awareness because we're hiding from the truth.
Totally. And so, yeah, then the physical stress is, well, we'd think it was obvious because you think of physical is the most sort of tangible thing, but we tell ourselves, no, that headache I've had for 6 months, that's nothing to do with stress, you know, it's all these different things. So physical stress turns up as, and I always say, like, you know, your body is far wiser than your mind when it is actually speaking. In terms of stress particularly, it's really time to pay attention because our body's very resilient. You know, you're not going to get an achy neck or a headache from one day of stress. That's a build-up in time over your system over quite a long period. So looking at things like headaches and neck aches, sore muscles, shoulders, backache, then digestive issues are hugely common with stress because when our stress response goes on, it actually sends resources away from what we need to digest. and just for us to survive. So blood goes away from your digestion. So your digestion shuts down in that sense. So things like IBS and, you know, all those stomach issues, stomach ulcers. And then, you know, looking at things like, again, it's that lack of sleep, it's raised blood sugar levels. It's also, you know, high cholesterol, raised blood pressure. And then it goes into looking at, you know, inflammatory things like skin issues, eczema, you know, hives. You know, the list is really endless. And then obviously those more serious things like actual heart attacks, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. And now studies even show that, you know, cancer can be formed from genes being turned on, expressive genes from long-term stress. So it's really, you know, it's a real minefield in terms of health for sure. It's physical stress, like I say, it's very obvious, but we always tell ourselves that, you know, no, that stomach issue I've had for ages, that's nothing to do with my stress. Absolutely not.
And then that person might open up with someone, and just someone else hearing that story would say, that's really stressful what you're going through.
Totally. And they're like, oh, yeah, maybe it is.
Maybe it is. And I love the way you brought in all the different examples there of the manifestation of stress on the body, and how stress, we always think it's mind, and it's just not.
Totally.
And looking at that connection between the mind body. I actually had a very interesting podcast guest yesterday, and we were talking about we've mislabeled mental health, haven't we? Because it's not just the mind. The body, 80% of the flow of information is from the body up to the mind. The body is so involved in mental health.
Totally. And I love that you say that, because I actually hate the term mental health. It really drives me mad because of the reasons like we talk about in the book. It's like we're such a holistic being. We've made up these four parts of ourselves. And so to just put something down to like physical health or just put something down to mental health, I don't feel there's a benefit to that in terms of, rather than looking, like you say, how it's so interconnected in so many ways. And
so interconnected. And even as you're speaking and that agreement, I can feel the soothing and notice the soothing in myself. It's like someone else gets it. We have to stop separating.
Yeah.
Because also the connotations of mental health are so negative. And it's actually, we need to be looking holistically at our bodies. And also looking at where people can take agency, responsibility, not just for themselves, but for care for others. We've become so going back to loneliness, so isolated with everything that we're not there to check in with others as much as perhaps we really need to be.
Totally. And I'll add as well the spiritual stress, because it's one of my favorites, because it's I define it with 2 points again, a bit like emotional. So we become spiritually stressed when we're totally out of alignment with our true authentic self, our soul self. So when we're going around life sort of doing what people would have us do, so society, family, and we can't even answer that question of sort of who am I without saying a label, like I'm a mother, I'm a doctor, when that's not who we are, it's what we are. And so it's really getting down to that authentic self and knowing it. So we become spiritually stressed when we don't, because we start to do things that are against who we really are and who we're meant to be. And then the other side is, you know, when we actually, so obviously when we are connected to that side, it's like we, you know, connect to our intuition, we connect to ourselves. And then the other side of spiritual stress is when we may have actually found that authenticity. We know who we are, we've connected to our intuition, but then we just totally disregard what our intuition says. And then we find ourselves in situations again that cause us stress, because it's that situation where like, I knew I should have done that, or I knew I shouldn't have done that. So it's those kind of two parts of it, really.
I think that's my favourite.
It's my favourite.
There's something in that. And it reminded me, I was very fortunate to go and see Bessel van der Kolk speak this week, and talking about labels. And he said, it's a shame we use labels, because actually it's getting curious about what the experience is for that other person. Not the label, whatever the label is. Let's hear the experience. Yeah. How is it for them? It's so nuanced, isn't it? What was the experience like for you? And everyone's spiritual element of what you've just said will be different. But it also reminds me of, are you familiar with Jen Lin's work of focusing?
No.
Oh, I think you'd love it. So he was a psychologist. He's passed away now, and he was working in, I think, Chicago with Carl Rogers. And he did a lot of work on focusing the mind, but on what the body really felt, and allowing yourself to get down to the deep, murky, yucky stuff and saying, oh, that's it, that fits. And that's what it is, isn't it? That who am I at my authentic core self that feels not murky, but just that matters to me.
Yeah.
And you know, sometimes people might say to you, oh, I bet it's about this, or I bet it's about that you're feeling that way. And you think, no. And then suddenly something hits and you go, that's it.
Yeah, totally.
My book, Choose You, is out now and offers you ways to prioritise you, meet your needs, say yes to you, develop a more secure sense of self where you feel you matter, learn to set boundaries, wrap yourself in self-love, find your authentic self, and ultimately choose you in the same way you would want those you love to choose themselves too. Choose You, out now. This brings me to the bit around acceptance. I'm going to read this out. I think you might have written it. Our hearts will never not be heavy until we have asked them what's truly weighing them down.
Yeah, I did write that, yeah.
And I wrote underneath, love, love, love. Oh, I was just, that is at the essence of it, isn't it? We have to, that self-acceptance and honesty with ourselves. Alice, we're running out of time. You're such a beautiful guest to talk to. But I did, before we move on to the last section of the podcast, you have a great section in the book, stress hacks. Now, I know we're jumping ahead, but I wonder whether you've got some that you could share here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think what's really important for people to understand with stress is that you don't have to have an hour every day to do your stress practices, you know, and people think, particularly when we're stressed, well, I don't have time, I'm too busy. That's the narrative we always tell ourselves. But first of all, we always make time for what's important to us. So you have to ask yourself, you know, is your health, is your well-being, is your emotional happiness, you know, your actual happiness, is that important to you? And most people would say yes. And so then you think, okay, well, I can do 5 minutes, either integrated into my day in tiny little stress snacks, essentially, or whether it's just, you know, 15 minutes in the morning or 20 minutes in the evening, just trying to make space for these things. So I think like a great stress hack for example, getting stress out of your body is a really great way to start hacking your stress, because our system is constantly thinking that it's, you know, unsafe and in fight and flight. You want to actually tell it, okay, it's time to switch that off. So doing things like I call like a zebra shakeout, like shaking your body from head to toe with your hands above your head and just really doing a shake for 2 to 3 minutes. And actually that will tell your system, just like a zebra running away from a lion will shake its whole body down after it's run. Okay, fine, go back into parasympathetic state. Or doing like balansana, you know, putting your legs up a wall, up your headboard at nighttime when you get into bed, making that your little evening ritual. You know, it's like, okay, I'm winding down, I've dimmed my lights, I've put my phone away because I'm not going to be on it for that last hour at least before I go to sleep. That's a great hack. Or putting your phone in a drawer for an hour in the evening, like out of sight, out of mind, then you're not actually, it's not there to touch. And just really connecting with what's around you, connecting with whether it's your cooking, whether it's your loved one's conversation, and just being fully in that moment without distraction. Because that also tells you, you know, the person you're with, that you're important, they're important to you rather than your phone. And that in itself will just increase that relationship in such an amazing way, that connection. But doing things like then, you know, making a little evening ritual for yourself. So like winding down your lights, putting your phone away, putting some relaxing music on, and then just having your legs up your headboard with your back flat, lying with your eyes closed, taking some deep breaths. That pose, balansana in yoga, itself puts you into parasympathetic state. So doing those little tiny hacks, and, you know, I also told clients to put, like, for example, 448 as a labeled alarm on their calendar throughout the day 5 times. And that's a breathing hack.
Yes.
So breathing in through your nose for 4, holding for 4, and then breathing out of your mouth for 8, because when we extend our exhales, again, that puts you into parasympathetic state. So if you can think, okay, just a little quiet, soothing or silent labeled alarm comes up in your calendar.
Yes.
So
That one.
that one 4 or 5 times a day, just saying
Yes.
448 or breathe, even for 2 minutes, no matter what you're doing, no matter whether you're writing a stressful email or whether you're on a phone call, you can still, just do those slower breaths and remind yourself to do that. So trying to use your body to hack your stress is a really good way to start. And then I love looking at, that age-old question I love journaling for emotional stress and starting to bridge that mind to emotions gap. And a lot of people that I found actually really struggle with how to start writing journaling. And so journal prompts are obviously so helpful. And my first go-to ones are always, how do I feel? And then how do I want to feel? And then once you've written those answers down, look at if those two things are aligned. And if they're aligned, then great, you can move on to something like, practicing gratitude, doing sort of reciting 5 things out loud that you're grateful for that day or more, and then moving on to a meditation or a breathing exercise, whatever suits you. But if they're really far apart, you think, okay, well, I want to feel calm today and I actually feel anxious. Then just looking and asking yourself, okay, well, what's one micro-intentional action I can take to help move me further towards the feeling I want? So what's that first step I can take, whether it's going for a walk or whether it's calling a friend that makes you feel better? Just something really small, and then you can build on that for the rest of the day and think, okay, well, at lunchtime I'll do one more action as well that can take me there as well. So just little things like this really make a huge, huge difference. And when it comes to the mind, obviously, I actually love Mo's hack for the mind is still my favorite. It's actually just like telling your brain what to do. We spend so much time letting our brain decide what we're thinking and guiding us in this frantic fear-based narrative or stress. And, Mo's such an incredible person at showing you that, your brain will literally do what you want it to if you tell it, but we don't tell it what to do. So it's just taking a pause when you realize you're in that fear-based narrative. I used to do a pattern interruption with clients called cancel. So it's like taking a deep breath when you notice that thought, being like, okay, cancel. So repeating it twice in your mind and then choosing your new thought that's helpful. And Mo always says, tell your brain to be like, brain, bring me a useful thought. And that's really helpful.
Brilliant. And that's reminded me of, and I use that in my work, but engaging it as the parenting brain.
Yeah.
So it's just that more adult self that comes in, that's the kinder version of our brain as opposed to the negative.
Totally.
And it works.
It really does. We just have to be aware. Like you say, you're talking about awareness. It's just the awareness of when it's happening and the awareness of us even having the ability to change these things for ourselves, because we haven't been brought up knowing how to sort of tell our brain what to do, knowing how to soothe our emotions or any of this. So.
I love those hacks, and there's lots in the book. I mean, there are lots of tips and tools and tricks, aren't there?
Yeah.
I think the important thing is we can't, and I always say this, we can't think our way out of a stress response. I know Mo's example is great, and that does help, but we have to make our body feel safe. Which is, I loved all the other things that you brought in, because then actually when your body feels safer, your prefrontal cortex comes back online. And that's when we can really care for ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's about that really making our body feel so much safer in the moment. And also constantly reaching out for support if you need it. That self-responsibility and agency. Because we aren't meant to do life alone.
No, totally. We're tribal, essentially. That's what we're meant to be in communities, looking after one another. But we've become so isolated as a society.
It's quite ugly, isn't it? It's quite ugly. I'd like to see that shifting. Okay, I have a great section that I always look forward to each week in the podcast, where I invite my wonderful Instagram community to come in with some questions. Sometimes I think, I should just let them guide the entire podcast, because I get thousands of questions come in, but I've picked 5 out. We are not going to have time for 5 today, so I think I'm going to pull out a couple, but the one that's jumping out now is how to deal with long-term stressful situations without affecting your health.
Yeah, I think it's like, I love that question, because obviously sometimes we are, and I've had that myself, where you're actually under stress for years, essentially from outside circumstances that you can't control. So it really is, again, about looking at, that phrase of, it's not about the events in your life, it's the way you deal with them. And so we have to give ourselves grace and be like, okay, if I'm in this situation and I can't change the actual outside scenario, the one thing I can control is my response. So every single day, I will put into, myself a practice to make sure that I'm telling my system in the evening that it is safe. So I would say, like, start with a morning little mini practice as well, like making sure that you're waking up and taking control of your response so you don't go into that reaction mode straight away. So giving yourself just 10 minutes in the morning to take a deep breath, check in with yourself, ask yourself how you feel, write in a journal, get that out of paper and start to process what you're going through, because so much time we spend spinning around on that stressful situation all day in our heads. So start to process it, and start to really also make sure that gratitude is a part of your practice in the morning, because when we're under stress, we find it so hard to look for the good. Automatically, even more so, we'll look for the negative that we already do from trying to keep ourselves safe. So creating those little spaces, and then making sure you're eating anti-inflammatory food as much as possible to support your body, because you don't want to be flooding it with sugar and alcohol and all these things at that time to just make it even more, because cortisol long term turns inflammatory, as we know, in our bodies. So trying to eat a sort of anti-inflammatory diet, very basically, of vegetables and meat and fish, all these different things, just whatever it is that you like, but just try to stay away from at least caffeine first thing in the morning, because you don't want that instant shot as soon as you wake up on an empty stomach. If you're stressed anyway, your body will just flood itself with even more cortisol. So make sure to not have caffeine for that first hour at least, and if you can, cut it out during that stressful time, or have matcha instead of coffee. Wonderful. And then in the evening, just making sure again, okay, I've been through this stressful situation all day, whatever it is you're dealing with, just again checking in with yourself and making yourself a sort of evening ritual, even for 5 minutes, because it depends on what the situation is for you. But if you have the space to do half an hour, if you have the space to do 5 minutes, creating that safe space for yourself to just be like, okay, body, what do you need? How can I tell you to calm down? Can I do a meditation? Can I go for a walk in nature? Can I listen to something that's actually positive, like a podcast that uplifts me at the end of my day, so that at least if I've had stress all day, I know that I'll get an injection of positivity at the end of my day. So it's really just looking at what part of you needs supporting the most based on your situation. Are you struggling with your mind? Are you struggling with how you feel? Is your body worn down? And just really looking at what needs support and creating a little ritual evening and morning, I'd say, even if for just 5 minutes, to try and support you.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I think, everyone's situation is so different, but there's something about that compassion to self in that moment, isn't there, as well? And almost permission for some joy in there as well. Not in outright happiness, but in that you can have little moments of more serene time in that stressful situation. I loved those tips. I loved those. Thank you. Another question, it might be our last one actually. Why does stress affect our decision-making ability?
Yes, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because we all know that we're really not very good at making decisions in stress. And that's because it is scientific. It shuts down, essentially, when we're stressed, the limbic system in our brain gets activated. And so that's all about your emotional response. It's about your fight and flight and your behavioral. And it actually shuts down that prefrontal cortex, which is about that rationale and that decision making and everything that we know we need to sort of take a step back and be like, what's the right choice in this moment? So if we're making a choice from a very highly stressed space, it's likely to be actually more emotionally fear-basedly led than it is to be rationally and decisively led, because you haven't accessed that part of your brain. So it's really important, if people think, okay, well, I can't make a decision, I'm struggling with these things at this time, to try and do as much to bring yourself into calm and to bring yourself into a non-stress space before you then make the decision, because you'll find it a lot easier to make it.
Yes, and we've touched on that throughout the podcast, I know, but it's quite nice to clarify it together there. And you're absolutely right, we need to make the body feel much safer. That's when we can think far more clearly. And Alice, the question I ask all my guests as I end the podcast is, what does it mean to you to choose you?
Oh, what does it mean to me to choose me? For me, I think choosing me has come down to choosing myself in terms of how I actually access that authentic self, accessing that soul self. That's choosing me. So actually doing things for myself that I know are right for me, but other people might not agree with, or actually whether that's, you know, saying no to going to an event because you think I'm actually too tired, even though that person would really want my support tonight. I know I'm actually exhausted. So how do I then make it up to them at a different time? Because we can get the best of both, really. It's kind of, really looking at choosing myself from that authentic place, from that soul place. And that's always that deeper wisdom guiding me rather than that fear in my mind.
Beautiful. Spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Alice, that was so lovely. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was so lovely.
It's been such a lovely conversation. I had so many other questions, but I think we're not going to have time today, sadly. So I appreciate the answers you have given today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you.